The Duke of Thornwood did not kiss his bride on their wedding night. He stood at the window of the candle-lit chamber, his back to her, and spoke as if he were delivering a business arrangement. Alara sat on the edge of the great canopied bed, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She had worn her mother's pearl combs in her hair and a gown of ivory silk that had taken 6 seamstresses a fortnight to finish. None of it mattered now. His voice was low, even, and completely without warmth. This marriage was a necessity, not a romance. You know that. I will give you my name, my protection, and every comfort. I ask only that you do not expect what I cannot give. She tried to speak, but the words would not come. What could she say? That she had hoped for something more. That she had spent the weeks before the wedding imagining quiet conversations by the fire, shared laughter, a hand reaching for hers in the dark. She had been foolish, and now her foolishness sat heavy in her chest like a stone. He turned at last. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Thornwood, was a man carved from granite and silence. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, though he was only 32. His eyes, the color of winter sea, passed over her without lingering. "Good night, Alara." He did not say her title. He left the room, and the soft click of the adjoining door sounded like a sentence. She did not cry. She sat very still, listening to the wind rattle the old glass of Thornwood Hall, and she understood for the first time what her life had become. She was a duchess. She was a stranger, and she was utterly alone. The first weeks were a careful, painful education. Thornwood Hall was vast, ancient, and beautiful in a severe way, all gray stone corridors and soaring windows that let in too much light and not enough warmth. The servants were polite but watchful. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, had served the family for 30 years and moved through the rooms with the quiet authority of a woman who knew every secret the house held. She was kind to Alara in the way one is kind to a guest who will soon be leaving, though Alara was not leaving. She was the new mistress. Only no one, least of all the Duke, seemed to remember it. Alara tried. She truly did. She had been raised with grace, the daughter of a baron whose fortunes had crumbled slowly and then all at once. She knew how to manage a household, how to smile when her heart ached, how to make herself useful. She ordered fresh flowers for the drawing room. She asked the cook about his favorite dishes. She waited for him at dinner each evening, dressed with care, the candles burning low on the long mahogany table, and each evening he sent word that he was occupied. One night in the 3rd week she gathered her courage and carried a tray of tea to the library herself. She found him bent over ledgers, his sleeves rolled, his expression dark with concentration. He looked up, and for one instant something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or annoyance. It was hard to tell. "I thought you might like some tea," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He looked at the tray, then at her. "I don't take tea this late." She stood there holding the tray, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "There is no reason you should." He turned back to his papers. "Mrs. Pemberton can see to my needs. You need not trouble yourself." Trouble herself, as if she were a maid, as if she were nothing at all. Alara set the tray down on a small side table, her hands trembling only a little. She did not argue. She did not demand his attention. She simply left the room, closing the door behind her with a gentleness that felt like defeat. That night she stood at her window, looking out over the dark sweep of the Thornwood Gardens. They had once been splendid, she could see that even in the moonlight. Roses ran wild over crumbling trellises. The hedges had lost their shape. The fountain at the center was dry and filled with dead leaves. It was a beautiful place that had been forgotten, and Alara felt an unexpected kinship with it. She was a beautiful thing, too, placed in a great house and left to fade. She decided then that she would not waste away waiting for a man who did not want her. She would find something else, something of her own. The next morning she put on a simple wool dress and walked down to the gardens. The head gardener, an elderly man named Collins, was startled to see her. He tried to dissuade her, insisting it was not work for a duchess. Alara smiled, that same gentle smile she had worn through every disappointment, and simply picked up a pair of shears. "I need to be useful, Mr. Collins. Please let me help." He had no answer for that, and so it began. Every morning, while the Duke locked himself away with his affairs, Alara worked in the garden. She cleared the dead brambles from the rose beds. She planted lavender along the stone paths. She scrubbed the fountain basin until the marble gleamed. Her hands grew calloused. Her skin, once pale and sheltered, took on a faint golden warmth from the sun. She did not mind. The ache in her muscles was a comfort. It was something she could control. Word spread through the household. Some of the servants whispered that the new Duchess was odd, that no lady of quality would dirty her hands with soil. But others began to look at her with a grudging respect. Mrs. Pemberton, who had watched the garden decay for a decade, started leaving pitchers of lemon water on the terrace. A young kitchen maid named Lily began sneaking out to help pull weeds. Slowly, imperceptibly, Thornwood began to shift around her. The Duke, however, noticed nothing. He came and went like a shadow, attending to business in the village, meeting with his steward, riding out across the estate at all hours. He rarely spoke to her beyond the barest civilities. Once she passed him in the corridor and he paused as if seeing her for the first time. She was in her gardening dress, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a basket of cut rosemary on her arm. He looked at her and something moved in his expression. Confusion, maybe. Then he nodded curtly and walked on. Alara did not allow herself to hope. She had learned that hope was a wound that would not heal if you kept picking at it. So she buried herself deeper in the garden and in the village beyond. She began visiting the tenants, carrying baskets of bread and medicine. She learned their names, their troubles, the names of their children. She sat with the elderly Mrs. Croft, who was bedridden, and read to her from old books of poetry. The villagers began to speak of her not as the Duke's wife, but as the kind lady of Thornwood. And in those small, quiet acts of care, Alara found a purpose that almost filled the hollow place inside her. Then one evening in late summer, everything changed. She had been invited to dine at the home of a neighbor, Sir Thomas Ashby, a young baronet whose land bordered Thornwood. He was warm where the Duke was cold, quick to smile, generous with his praise. He had seen her at the village fair, helping to serve tea to the children, and had immediately sought an introduction. Since then, he had been a steady, gentle presence, bringing her books he thought she might enjoy, asking after the garden with genuine interest. The Duke was not expected at the dinner. He had a meeting in the county town and would be gone until late. So Alara went alone, wearing a gown of soft blue that Lily had helped her press. Sir Thomas greeted her with a smile that lit his whole face. They dined in a small, candle-lit room that felt nothing like the cavernous dining hall at Thornwood. He asked her about the garden, and she found herself talking freely for the first time in months. She laughed. She did not realize how rare the sound had become until she saw the way Thomas looked at her, as if she were a song he had almost forgotten. They walked in his rose garden after dinner. The evening air was sweet with jasmine. He stopped beneath an arbor and turned to her, his voice suddenly serious. "You are not happy at Thornwood." It was not a question. Alara looked down at her clasped hands. "I am learning to be content." "That is not the same thing." He hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her hand. "If you ever need a friend, a true friend, I hope you know you have one in me." She felt tears burn behind her eyes. She blinked them away, but not before Thomas saw. He did not press. He simply stood with her in the quiet garden, offering a kindness that felt like water to parched earth. When she returned to Thornwood, the house was dark and still. She climbed the stairs to her room, her heart lighter than it had been in months. And then she opened the door and found the Duke standing by the window, his silhouette rigid against the moonlight. "You were out late." His voice was flat, but there was an edge beneath it she had never heard before. "Sir Thomas invited me to dine. I understood you would be away." "I returned early." He turned, and his eyes swept over her in a way they never had before. There was something sharp and searching in his gaze, something that made her pulse quicken. "You wore that dress for him." The injustice of the question stole her breath. He had never once looked at her with anything but polite distance, and now he stood there accusing her of something, as if she had betrayed a bond that did not exist. Anger, hot and sudden, rose in her chest. "I wore what I had," she said quietly. "You have never cared what I wore." He flinched. It was small, barely a tightening of his jaw, but she saw it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked past her, pausing at the door. "Sir Thomas is not suitable company. I would prefer you did not see him again." And then he was gone, leaving her trembling with a mixture of fury and something else, something dangerous and fragile that she had sworn she would never feel again. Hope. The next morning the house was buzzing with a strange energy. Mrs. Pemberton informed her that the Duke had cancelled his appointments for the day, something he almost never did. He was in the garden. Alara felt a chill of something that was not quite fear. She pulled on her gardening gloves, the leather soft and worn, and walked out into the pale morning light. She found him standing at the edge of the restored rose beds, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the fountain that now sparkled with clear water. The climbing roses she had coaxed back to life were in full bloom, cascading over the trellis in drifts of cream and blush. The air smelled of lavender and damp earth. He did not turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders tense. "You did this," he said. "It was not a question." "I needed something to do." She stopped a few feet away from him, wary. "Collins helped, and Lily." He turned then, and his face was unreadable. The morning light carved the lines of his features into something almost beautiful, the hard planes softened, the gray eyes catching a hint of blue. "I haven't seen this garden look like this since my sister died." Alara's heart gave a strange thump. He had never mentioned a sister. She knew so little about him. She opened her mouth to ask, but he spoke again, his voice rougher now. "Isabella loved roses. After she was gone, I could not bear to come here. I let it all go." He reached out and touched a single bloom, his fingers astonishingly gentle. "I should thank you. You have brought it back to life." It was the most he had ever said to her, the most honest. Alara felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back. "I'm glad. I didn't know about your sister. I'm sorry." He nodded, a short, sharp movement. Then he looked at her fully, and something shifted in the air between them. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a duty or an inconvenience, but as a person. His gaze moved over her sun-warmed face, her calloused hands, the simple dress that had once belonged to a maid and now fit her better than any silk gown. "You have changed," he said, and there was a note in his voice she could not name. "So have the roses," she answered quietly. "That is what happens when you stop waiting for someone else to care for you." The words hung in the air, simple and true, and she saw them land. Something flickered in his expression. Hurt, regret. She did not stay to analyze it. She turned and walked back toward the house, her heart beating hard, and did not look back. A week later, the first heavy rains of autumn came, and the river that ran through the estate swelled dangerously. Word reached Thornwood that the cottages in the lower valley were at risk of flooding. The Duke left at once with a party of men to shore up the banks. Alara did not hesitate. She gathered blankets, food, and what medicine she had, and set off toward the village in the driving rain, Lily at her side. The world had become a blur of water and mud. By the time they reached the cottages, the river was already lapping at the doorsteps. Alara helped the families move their belongings to higher ground, her skirts heavy with water, her hair plastered to her face. She did not think of herself. She thought only of the children, their frightened eyes, the elderly who could not walk without help. She was carrying a small boy toward the safety of the cart when she heard the shout. It was him, the Duke, riding through the storm like a specter, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He saw her, and something broke open in his face. In all the months she had known him, she had never seen such raw emotion. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, wading through the rising water toward her. "Are you hurt?" His hands were on her shoulders, his grip almost painful. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she gasped. "The children, Mrs. Croft, I need to get them to the hall." He stared at her, rain streaming down his face, and for a heartbeat she thought he might pull her into his arms. But he only nodded, his jaw tight, and began shouting orders to his men. They worked side by side through the long, terrible hours, and when at last everyone was safe within the warm, dry walls of Thornwood, Alara collapsed onto a bench in the great hall, too exhausted to move. The Duke found her there. He knelt before her, still dripping with rain and river water, and took her cold, scratched hands in his. His voice was hoarse. "You could have died, you could have been swept away. Why did you go down there?" She looked at him, this cold, distant man who was now kneeling at her feet, and she spoke the simple truth. "Because no one else was going to help them, and because I stopped waiting for you to see me." The silence that followed was immense. It seemed to fill the whole hall, pressing against the walls. The Duke did not move. He held her hands as if they were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water. His head was bowed. She could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the tension in the broad line of his shoulders, the way his chest rose and fell as if he were fighting for breath. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. She had never imagined he could cry. The Duke of Thornwood, carved from granite and silence, was weeping. "I see you now," he said, his voice cracking on every word. "God help me, Alara, I see you now, and I am terrified." She should have pulled away. She should have guarded her heart, the heart that had been bruised and ignored for so long. But she was too tired, and the warmth of his hands around hers felt like the first sunlight after a long winter. So she sat still, and she let him speak. "I have been a fool." He pressed her hands to his forehead, his shoulders shaking. "When I married you, I told myself it was duty. My father had left debts, and your father had agreed to the match to save his own name. I convinced myself I was doing you a favor, giving you a title, a home. I never let myself believe it could be anything more." Alara's throat was tight. "You made it very clear there would never be anything more." "Because I was afraid." He lifted his head, and the raw honesty in his face stole her breath. "Isabella was the only person I ever truly loved, and I lost her. She was riding a horse I had given her. She fell. She was only 17. I held her hand as she died, and I swore I would never let myself love anyone that way again. Loving someone means losing them. I could not survive that again." The confession fell between them like a stone into still water. Alara felt the ripples move through her, shifting everything she thought she knew. She had spent months believing he was cold, indifferent, incapable of feeling. She had been wrong. He was a man drowning in grief, too afraid to reach for a shore. "And the portrait," she whispered. "In the West Wing, the woman with the dark hair and the rose in her hand. I thought she was a lost love." His expression broke into something like anguished surprise. "That is Isabella, you thought." He closed his eyes, and a sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. "There has never been anyone else. Only you, from the first moment I saw you, a year before we married at a garden party in Wiltshire. You were laughing, and the sunlight caught your hair, and I could not breathe. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was not worthy of such light. So I stayed away, and I let you think I was indifferent, when in truth I was burning alive every moment I could not touch you." Alara's tears spilled over at last. She remembered that garden party. She had worn a yellow dress, and she had been happy that day before her father's debts had swallowed everything. She had noticed the quiet, stern-faced Duke watching her from across the lawn. She had thought he was judging her. She had been so wrong. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "All these months I thought I was invisible to you. I thought I was a burden." "Because I am a coward." He released her hands and sat back on his heels, looking up at her with a desperation that made him seem younger, stripped of all his cold authority. "I thought if I kept you at a distance I would not hurt you, and I thought if I never admitted what I felt I would not lose you. But I see now that I have been losing you every single day. When I saw you with Sir Thomas, when I saw the way you smiled at him, I felt something I have never felt before. Jealousy. Fear. I realized that you might find happiness with someone else, and the thought destroyed me." She remembered that night, the hard accusation in his voice. She had been angry then. Now she only felt a deep, aching sadness for the wasted months, the unnecessary loneliness. "I am not a possession," she said quietly. "I am not a rose you can leave to wither and then expect to bloom only for you." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know that, and I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am begging for it anyway. I am begging you to give me a chance to make things right, not because it is my duty, not because of any contract or obligation, because I love you. I love you, Alara, and I have loved you for so long that I forgot what it felt like not to be afraid." The words hung in the air, fragile and enormous. Alara looked at him, this man who had been a stranger, a ghost in his own house, and she saw him clearly for the first time. He was broken, yes, but he was also brave enough to kneel in the wreckage and ask her to stay. She leaned forward and touched his face, her calloused fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He closed his eyes at the contact, a shudder running through him. "I am not a ghost," she said softly. "I am not your sister. Loving me will not destroy you. But if you want me, Alexander Ashford, you must let me in, completely. No more locked doors, no more silence." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "No more silence," he repeated. "I swear it." The great hall was quiet around them, the storm still beating against the windows, but inside there was only this: two people who had been lost, finally found. That night, for the first time, there was no adjoining door between them. He came to her chamber not as a duke fulfilling an obligation, but as a man trembling with hope. They sat before the fire, and he told her everything. About Isabella's death, the guilt that had eaten at him for years. About the secret payments he had made to settle her father's debts before the marriage, never wanting her to feel indebted. About the many times he had stood in the shadows, watching her work in the garden, too afraid to step into the light. She listened and she wept, and she forgave him. Not because the pain of the past months vanished in an instant, but because she could see the man he was trying to become. And she, who had rebuilt a ruined garden from dead earth, understood that beautiful things could grow from broken places. In the days that followed, Thornwood Hall began to feel like a home. The Duke did not suddenly become a different man. He was still reserved, still serious. But now he sought her out. He walked with her in the garden each morning. He asked about her work with the tenants and soon began joining her on her visits, carrying baskets and lifting heavy barrels without complaint. The villagers stared at first, seeing their stern lord kneeling to speak with a child, but they soon grew used to it. Sir Thomas Ashby came to call one afternoon, and Alara received him with warmth, introducing him to the Duke with a steady hand on her husband's arm. The two men spoke civilly, and when Thomas left, there was a new understanding in his eyes. He pressed Alara's hand briefly. "You deserve every happiness," he said, and she knew he meant it. The Duke watched him go, then turned to Alara with an expression she had come to know well, a flicker of the old jealousy, quickly suppressed. She laughed softly and kissed his cheek. "You have nothing to fear," she said. "You are my home now." He pulled her close, resting his chin on her hair. "I am still learning to believe that." "Then I will teach you," she whispered, "every day for as long as it takes." Autumn deepened into winter, and the garden slept beneath a blanket of snow. But inside Thornwood, something bloomed. Laughter returned to the corridors. The servants, who had once pitied the young Duchess, now smiled when they saw her walking hand in hand with the Duke. Mrs. Pemberton, who had known Alexander since he was a boy, caught Alara alone one evening and pressed a small velvet box into her hands. "This belonged to his mother," the old housekeeper said, her eyes glistening. "She would have wanted you to have it." Inside was a ring of sapphires and pearls, delicate as a frozen flower. Alara wore it at dinner that night, and the Duke's eyes filled with tears when he saw it. "She would have loved you," he said hoarsely. "My mother, she would have loved you." "I wish I had known her," Alara replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. It was no longer a cold, formal gesture. It was simply two people choosing each other. On a bright morning in early spring, when the first green shoots were pushing through the soil of the restored garden, Alara stood at the fountain and watched the sunlight sparkle on the water. She felt a presence behind her and did not turn. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, and a familiar voice murmured against her ear. "I have a gift for you." She turned, curious. He held a small, folded document. She opened it and saw a deed, the legal language dense but unmistakable. She looked up, confused. "It is the garden," he explained, his voice suddenly shy. "Legally, I have given it to you, freehold. It is yours completely and forever. No one can ever take it from you. Whatever happens, you will always have this place." She stared at him, her heart too full for words. He had given her many things in the past months, his time, his trust, his fragile, growing love. But this was something else. This was a promise that she would never again be a guest in her own life. "Why?" she managed to whisper. He cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes soft as morning mist. "Because you taught me that love is not a cage. It is a garden. It needs space to grow and sunlight and care. I wanted you to know that I will never lock you away again. You are free, Alara. Free to stay, free to go. I only hope you will choose to stay with me." She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure, unguarded joy. "I choose you," she said. "Today, tomorrow, for all the days after, I choose you, Alexander." He kissed her then in the garden that had once been a ruin and was now in full, glorious bloom. The fountain sang beside them. The roses nodded in the breeze. And somewhere in the quiet places of the old hall, the ghosts of old grief finally rested. She had come to Thornwood as a duty, a piece of a contract, a girl in a silk gown waiting for a love that never came. She had stopped waiting. She had planted herself in the cold earth and decided to grow. And in the end, she had not needed him to save her. She had saved herself. But he had come to her anyway, across the ruined garden of his own heart, and knelt and asked to be let in. Love had not been a sudden storm. It had been a slow, steady thaw, a garden reclaimed, a silence broken, a man who learned to weep, a woman who learned to hope again. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.